Welcome to another episode of Outside Ourselves. I am your host, Kelsi Climbera, and today's conversation is with pastor and professor Ken Jones. Ken is a professor out of Grandview University. He's one of my favorite contributors to edit for at 1517, and today we are having a conversation that centers around answering the question, what does it mean to die a good death? How do we view death in light of Christ's resurrection and in light of the new life that we have received because of Christ's life and death and resurrection, his work on the cross? Ken suggests that we use Luther as our guide to answer these questions, which I think is good advice. I think you're in for a very thoughtful conversation. Before we get started, I wanted to make a note about the audio in this episode. I had a few technical difficulties when we were filming, all of which will be fixed in upcoming episodes, and I don't think it's anything that should deter you from listening to our conversation. And then I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that while we recorded this episode early last week, at the end of last week, we lost someone very, very special to 1517, Dr. Rod Rosenblatt. Dr. Rosenblatt died on February 2nd, this past Friday. He was a friend and mentor and professor to so many who work at 1517. He is one of the clearest voices, I think, on receiving salvation by grace through faith in Christ alone. That message rang so true and so clearly through all of his teaching and all of his speaking. You may have heard his words yourself on the White Horse Inn radio show, on the Thinking Fellows podcast, or in the most recent of years, his Talks with Dad Rod videos, which are on the 1517 YouTube channel. Dr. Rosenblatt will be missed. We mourn his loss. But as you will coincidentally hear in today's episode with Ken, as Christians, we mourn not as those without hope. We know that we will see Dr. Rosenblatt again, along with all the saints who go before us. And with that, here's today's episode. Hey, Ken, welcome to Outside Ourselves. It's good to see you.
Hi, Kelsi. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, I am excited about today. I was thinking about the shows that I've had in the past leading up to our conversation and realized that
We did a kind of roundtable at a Here We Still Stand event.
Yes.
Gosh,
We did.
2019, something like that.
Yeah.
So that's almost 5 years ago now.
Yeah. And that was on the topic we're going to be discussing today, death and dying. But I realized on this show, we have not talked. We've talked a lot about suffering. That was like a huge theme for a lot of guests that I had on last year. But coincidentally, I haven't really talked a ton to people about specifically death, which is, of course, tied to suffering, tied to so much of theology, and specifically such a big theme and important thing in the type of theology that we espouse. So I'm excited, even though it is a kind of grave topic and one that's a lot of people don't want to talk about. I think that this conversation is going to be really interesting and beneficial for people. How did you get into theology? Like you said, you started your undergrad studies as a German major, or were you a pastoral?
I wasn't a religion major.
Okay.
I went to Bible camp in seventh grade, a skinny little bedwetter from an alcoholic family that was dysfunctional, and I heard something really wonderful there. I'd known these stories kind of tangentially in my life, but this is where it kind of became for you, know. And so I kept going to Bible camp. And then when I graduated from high school, I worked at the same camp system for 4 summers. And then one winter season as a retreat host. And, then I became a youth director. It's just this natural progression that the church had got a grip on me somehow, that it didn't want to let go.
Hmm.
And, along the way, I met all these great pastors, and I thought, I want to do that. I
Yeah.
went to seminary, and I thought that I was going to be in a helping profession, um, and then had my first class with Gerhard Ferde. And I had a class from Gerhard, and just had my head exploded
Hmm.
because of how he talked about theology, how the gospel works and what it is. And he somehow did somatic gene therapy in me. They're doing this gene therapy now with um, people who have sickle cell anemia, that they do stuff with their genes to change their body's makeup so that their bodies produce healthy whole round blood cells rather than sickle shaped um, deficient, I guess,
Okay.
red blood cells, right? And
Hmm.
and and there's been a woman that NPR's reported on along the way that's virtually cured because of that, and that's what Gerhard and Jim Nissigan did to me.
Hmm.
That I no longer was interested in being a helper, but I saw myself as being called, as Jim called it, to deliver the goods,
Hmm.
to to be a public proclaimer of the gospel, that my job wasn't going to be to fix people.
Hmm.
And when I went back for my doctorate, then I'd been a pastor for 7 8 years in a parish, and I wasn't I didn't go back to become a professor at all. I was just really, I wanted to understand what it was that I did week in, week out. How does this theology work? How does preaching happen? What's what's going on? How does
Yeah.
um and that's why, when I did my doctorate with Jim Kittleson, um, I was really intent on doing research and writing something that was connected to real life.
Hmm.
I'm a church historian, so I cleverly quip that we church historians have to deal with actual texts and actual events and actual people, unlike systematic theologians who can make stuff up, you know. Um, but I wanted to do something not. I wanted to do work that mattered to people,
Yeah.
and I came across this set of 15 funeral sermons by a guy named Johann Spangenberg,
Yeah.
um, who was a contemporary of Luther's and was one of the early supporters of the Reformation,
Hmm.
and became quite important. And his son Kyriakos became even more important in the Reformation.
Hmm.
And there was this set of 15 funeral sermons that were written as kind of like Luther's postals, these sample sermons for how pastors ought to go about preaching at a funeral.
Hmm.
What exactly is entailed when you proclaim the gospel in a situation where death has entered.
Hmm.
And so that was the start of the whole thing, doing research on um, 16th century German evangelical funeral preaching.
Okay.
That there's a ton of funeral sermons published.
Yeah.
It's the 16th century equivalent of a newspaper obituary. That's how
Well,
you knew that nobles were had died.
yeah, that
But
makes
but
sense.
of course there aren't any published sermons of people like us,
Right.
just regular folks.
Yeah.
And so these sample sermons became a way to understand what was intended for anybody's funeral.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that it was a way you studied it because it's a way to gauge the success of the Reformation. Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
why
there's
funeral
there's a,
preaching
there's
would be a way to gauge that?
there this is 20 years ago or 25 years ago now. that there just was a lot of talk about whether Luther was a success or not,
Yeah.
whether the Reformation was a success. And many people argue that, well, it didn't spread across all of Europe, and then the Reformed church following Calvin and Zwingli arose, and then there were all those other people
Yeah.
like Menno and Jakob Hutter and people like that,
Right.
and the Catholics, yeah, they had a council, but they didn't really change any theology or anything. So the Reformation was a failure.
Mm.
And my argument is no. If there's somebody who continues to preach and teach in this kind of radical tradition, that the Reformation remains a success.
That's interesting. I know that Robert Kolb's done some work on in this area as well, and I cannot remember. I'm not going to remember
Yeah,
the
Robert
article.
Kolb's book on the Wittenberg Circle
Uh huh.
about, I mean, essentially, it's that book is about the 16th century equivalent of social media.
Yeah.
That how
Okay.
those people who'd read and encountered Luther connected with one another and advanced that kind of teaching and preaching of the
Yeah.
gospel.
Well, that's so what I was thinking of is there's an article he's written, and I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes, but he intros with this story of just a woman who's like you and me. She's not famous or anything, but for some reason there's some record of kind of how she spent her last days, and she she dies, I think, after giving birth to like her sixth or seventh child. And he's making the argument, and he's telling the story that this woman, as now a evangelical Christian who's come away from the Catholic Church, dies. I think her last words are something like, "I'm ready to go see Jesus." She's very content, and she's very assured. And I've always found that really interesting about Lutheran preaching can offer people, specifically in that time where I know that there's not like a ton of record of that, but we do have some stories where people who maybe would have been fearful going into death are now all of a sudden very comforted because they know where they're going. They've been assured what you were mentioning earlier, that you wanted to be a help as a that's why you originally got into pastoral work and theology, but you became something else. Can you distinguish that difference a little bit more for people? And maybe that will lead us into kind of how you see Luther and people like Spangenberg changing uh, the way that funerals were thought of and death was thought of in the 16th century. But I want people to be clear, because I think when they hear uh, of a pastor, people's mind automatically goes to, well, that is a helper. So what do you
Yeah,
mean by that difference
you know,
exactly?
I think where we have to start with that is a Latin phrase, okay? And it's this facete quod in te est.
Mm,
Do what is within you to do.
yeah.
And that is kind of how the theology, the Roman theology that Luther was taught functions. That um, God will give you the grace to desire to do better, and you need to do better in the job of acquiring grace,
Yeah.
so that when you die, you will have enough grace. You can kind of think of it as fuel in your tank,
Mm-hmm.
that will compensate for your deficits in sin, so
Yeah.
that you will die in a state of grace rather than in a state of sin. And then if you're a saint, that you will go directly to heaven. But if you're not, then you will spend time in purgatory in order to continue working off those sins,
Mm,
and prove Jesus's promise to be valid for you,
yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So what Luther saw and what he was taught, and what he came to contend with in the church of his day was this overarching push to, as we say in South Dakota, get your poop in a group. Um, that, that that you need to have your house in order because you will die, and to encourage that, all kinds of helps were produced by the late Middle Ages. Things like these woodcuts called Memento Mori, um, and we can find some links for you to post for viewers so that they can see some of those. The pictured scenes where that would remind you that death is present. Okay, that there's one I use in my class, that shows just this cherubic little baby with an hourglass nearby to say, tempus fugit, time is fleeting, get going. And it's lying back on a skull, that to say even babies need to know that death is coming. Or another one where this guy is standing on a slab of stone that is laid across crosswise over a grave, and he's standing on his grave, and in his long beard you can see in the woodcut a skull that is part of the hair of his beard. So you've got those. Memento mori means remember death. Death rate in our time is the same as it was in the 16th century. The human death rate is 100%.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
But I think we live in a culture that is less aware of the presence of death.
Yeah.
I mean, I think kids by the time they finish high school witness like 200,000 deaths on screens. We're just numb to it.
Yeah.
And when people die, they take the body away to a funeral home where it's cleaned up. And but in the 16th century, you couldn't avoid that at all.
Right.
You had to tend to your loved one's body yourself. And with the plague, it was like the sword of Damocles hanging over your head by a spider web. That sword will come down on you at any time.
Yeah.
And so I think the awareness of death was much more heightened, right? So you combine that heightened awareness of death with this urgent appeal to get your act together.
Yeah.
And it meant that people were worried about their salvation. Okay. And so a whole bunch of literature that we now call the Ars Moriendi arose. And that's Ars Moriendi means the art of dying. And they were treatises that were written by people like Jean Gerson, to help lay people help somebody else in the process of dying so that they would die a good death. And so a good death, well, what's a good death going to be? Well, if the catchphrase is do what is within you to do, then a good death means knowing you've done enough.
Yeah.
And so these little handbooks on the art of dying gave advice for helping somebody on their deathbed. That you should get your house in order, of course, and you should you should probably consider the saints and their example for how to live an exemplary life in the time you have left. Follow their example, and it might be a good idea. These little books advised to get yourself a crucifix and meditate on that crucifix for an example of how to die well in horrible circumstances. That Jesus functioned as a way to to show you how to do it better. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you should take the sacrament if it's available to you. But the whole goal was to help people consider all the ways that they had um, engaged in religious activity
Hmm. It's almost like,
and acts of charity in
yeah.
order to prove to God that they had done enough. And Jesus' only presence in that entire system in these little handbooks, which are kind of representative of how the theological system and the church's practice worked in the late medieval era,
Yeah.
um, all they did was just promote that kind of hamster wheel religious life.
Yeah.
You get on that wheel and you have to do more and more and more, and you never know if you've done enough.
Yeah.
So Luther came along then, and with his new theological understanding, which he argued was not new, it was exactly what was in Augustine and in Paul.
Hmm.
Um, he said, no, um, the the only work that needs to be done is done on the cross
Hmm.
for you.
Yeah.
It's done, and all that's left for you is to trust that it's been done for you, not just for, not just God so loved the world, but God so loved you
Hmm.
individually, so that you might have confidence in your status before God. And that means that when somebody's on their deathbed, that it's a whole different um, to-do list for
Hmm.
somebody. That the job is not to get them to try to improve themselves, but instead to impress on them who Christ is, so
Hmm.
that they can be confident of of what their Lord has accomplished
Yeah.
without any effort on their own. And so you have now two different understandings of what a good death is.
Hmm. Okay.
And so in the first instance, a good death is having done enough works apart from Christ. And the second is Christ has done it all. And the only question to ask is, do you trust it or
Yeah.
not? Luther said that he wrote this great little piece called the Sermon on Preparing to Die. It's not really a
Mm.
sermon; it's kind of a devotional thing that the his prince's counselor asked him to write something for a nobleman named Marcus Shart,
Hmm.
um, and who was worried. He was anxious about his own death. And Luther was so busy, we kept putting it off and putting it off. And then he said, "Oh, you should read something that the head of our order, Johann Staupitz, wrote." And then finally, he wrote this little piece called "The Sermon on Preparing to Die," that in essence is Luther taking these treatises on the art of dying and turning them inside out,
Hmm.
so that he says, you don't look to the saints as examples of how to live a good life. You look to the saints as an example of how how strong God's promise is, that
Hmm.
you can trust it even in the most dismaying circumstances.
Hmm.
You look to the cross not with Jesus as your example, but you look to the cross to see how committed God is to you.
Hmm.
You see,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a contrast there, right?
Yeah. I actually had not read the Sermon on Preparing to Die, so I kind of browsed it a little
Well,
bit
then
last
we're
night.
done.
No, goodbye.
See you later, everybody.
I read it, Ken. I read it.
Okay.
Um, and I was really struck by, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seemed to me like something that stood out to me was the way Luther talks about how you should even consider death. And that seems like a huge reversal. Instead of letting it seems to me like what you're saying was kind of the way that people thought of death at the time, was to make it large and to let it loom over you so that you kind of got your butt in order and got your things together. You let it kind of scare you into action. And he, I think at one point says, no, you think about death. Like we need to have it in front of us. But when in light of the cross, we see death as it really is, which is like this, I can't remember what descriptor he uses, but
he
kind of this silly thing it's not for the Christian anything that you have to worry or be concerned about. You should think about it. You shouldn't put it off, but it changes the lens in which you view it.
Luther understood that we all have consciences that we have to deal with.
Yeah.
In fact, in his big speech, at the Diet of Worms, he said that he said, "My conscience is captive to the Word of God." And nowadays we hear conscience and we think of those Tom and Jerry cartoons with the little devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other speaking into our ears, do it, don't do it, do it, don't do it. But that's not what Luther meant by conscience. Conscience for him was your understanding of your relationship in three areas. First of all and foremost, your relationship with God. The Latin phrase for that is coram Deo, which means literally in the face of God.
Yeah.
What is your standing in relationship to God? And then also in relationship to your fellow human beings, the people that you're connected to, and finally in relationship to the world. Okay? And that all kinds of things in life trouble our consciences. Relationships that don't go well. My students get a bad grade on a test that they studied hard for, or they don't get into the nursing program, or they failed a test in the nursing program and have been booted from the nursing program, or they're they got recruited for the wrestling team and they're not getting time on the mat. I mean, and so they get troubled in their understanding of who they are in this entire web of relationships that they're a part of. Okay. And the most important aspect of that is the relationship with God. And Luther's argument is that the theology that he was taught and that the church preached and taught and practiced was ineffective in dealing with people's troubled consciences. That it didn't give them comfort at all. And that's actually why he wrote the 95 Theses, because Johann Tetzel was in the area selling indulgences as a way, and he was playing on people's consciences. He was the equivalent of a sponsor on public radio that I hear many mornings that talks about how they clean dryer vents. and every morning I hear that sponsorship spot and think, our house is going to burn down.
I got to get those vents.
I got to get this taken care of. Why haven't I pulled that dryer out and looked at the hose going to the vent, right? I got to do something. And in fact, last week our washer broke and we had the service guy out and I pulled all kinds of things out of the laundry room in anticipation out of that. And I thought, I'm going to deal with my troubled conscience once and for all when it comes to my dryer. And I pulled that dryer out and checked the hose and it was nice and clear. And I'm like, screw you, dryer vent wizards. You made me feel horrible for not checking my dryer vent. Well, that's exactly how it worked in the 16th century. Tetzel was out there making people feel awful about something they never had to feel awful about. And that's what drove Luther to write the 95 Theses, the disputation on indulgences.
And Luther had a word, right? That's where we're getting this. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how that word hopefully is not only given in funeral sermons, but is given in all types of sermons. What are we talking about when we talk about that?
Every preacher needs to understand that the people they're preaching to or speaking to in some other pastoral encounter are dealing somehow with death.
Yeah.
Okay. Certainly their own impending death at some
Mm-hmm.
point in the future, but also the death of loved ones. If you're talking to any random group of people, about 20% of them are actively grieving the death of a friend or loved one
Mm-hmm.
somehow. Um, but there's a scholar named Kenneth Doak who's done all kinds of work on grief. And I have my death and dying students this semester reading his book called Death is a Journey. And in there, he talks about other kinds of losses, like what I talked about, things that my students might experience with grades or programs or, a breakup of a relationship, that those kinds of losses are a death of ourselves.
Okay.
That we have um, a hoped for future, and that dies, and our place in that future dies somehow. There are those kinds of losses, but also there are deaths of people that the society considers unworthy of grief, like a criminal, somebody who's executed, or I did a funeral for somebody who died of AIDS back in 1988, 89, in my internship. Um, and the family wouldn't allow me to say the word AIDS at
Wow.
all, you know. And they weren't, society wouldn't allow them to fully grieve
Yeah.
that horrible death.
Yeah.
Or there are deaths like the death of a pet, or there are people who grieve like developmentally disabled people,
Yeah. Or I was thinking
or
even miscarriage is something, we've talked
yeah,
about,
or
which
or
is
or little kids,
yeah.
and the phrase he uses as kind of an umbrella for all those kinds of situations, excuse me, is disenfranchised grief.
Hmm.
And so if you're a preacher and you look out in your sanctuary at who's sitting in the pews, you can know that 1 in 5 people is grieving a death somehow.
Wow.
But if you begin to include the disenfranchised losses, that those numbers go up to 80%
Oh wow. Okay.
in any group of people.
That's crazy.
That loss is huge. And so I would contend that for preachers, they need to understand that you just do not have to scratch very deep
Huh.
before you get to this well of loss,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And um, and people are dealing with medical diagnoses,
Yeah.
with spouses, with aging, with relationships that aren't working,
Mm-hmm.
and that all of it is death's presence
Hmm.
as a result of the events in the garden in Genesis chapter 3,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Where now what God declared about eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is present for us where it wasn't before.
Yeah.
That our life is a river of sorrows
Hmm.
that we are wading through somehow. And if we don't have a word to speak of that, then the church might as well give up
Hmm. Yeah.
and get out of the business, because Starbucks at least has better coffee than
Right.
most churches.
Yeah.
And so you're asking a bit about what the content is,
Yeah.
and I think the first thing is to say um, you're not in control, and you
Hmm.
never were. That it isn't all on your shoulders at all. That God has laid a claim on you that is unmitigated and eternal.
Yeah.
And here's something that you can count on when you're facing the vicissitudes of life, all these varieties of ways you can die, especially if you're in Australia, apparently. That there's something that you can actually stand on.
Yeah.
That isn't shifting at all. Then the next move is to say, not only do you not have to do anything, you can't do anything. And that actually was Luther's first move in his Reformation discovery, was understanding that this dictum to do what is within you to do, he couldn't do.
Yeah.
He
Right.
wrote about that late in his life in his preface to the Latin works. He said, I just grew to hate God because of these demands. But then the next move for him was to discover in Romans how clear God's declaration was on account of Christ, that there's nothing for you to do, and that preaching in the sacraments, their sole purpose is to declare that again and again and again to those who've never heard it. But I think for us in the church today, to say it again to people who desperately need to hear it again.
We'll just say it. Maybe this will get edited out. We had a little pause. We're starting back up again. Ken just had a great spiel about the sacraments, and I'm going to make him do it all over again. We were talking when we left off about how necessary it is to hear this proclamation of gospel, of
and
Christ
that
conquering
the
death over
sacraments
and
are
over
part and parcel
again.
of that proclamation. That baptism is given so that you don't have to wonder ever about where you stand. That in 1960, in this little town in western South Dakota, at this little white wood frame church, I was baptized. I had water poured over me, and I was declared a child of God publicly. It wasn't something that was internal inside me, that I ever have to wonder if I can gin up enough emotion or feeling or awareness of God or depth of commitment, but that God did something, that it's an actual historical event for me, but also because that event included God's word and declaration over me, which is eternal. I can also not just say I was baptized, but I am baptized.
Yeah. And that
Okay?
declaration is that you, Ken Jones, me, Kelsi Climbera, that we are saved, that we are redeemed, and that we cling to the promise that we will be reunited
Yeah, the
with
one
Christ.
who about whom people in Sunday's reading said spoke with such authority, spoke in your baptism, Kelsi, and said, "I am the resurrection of the life, and I am giving that resurrection and life to you. That even every one of your enemies cannot prevail against it." That's what Luther's hymn "A Mighty Fortress" is all about, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the great Gracia Grindel translation, "Were they to take our house, goods, honor, child, or spouse, the life be wrenched away, they cannot win the day. God's kingdom's ours forever." Right?
Right.
In much the same way, in the Lord's Supper, then we swallow that bread and wine, and it goes out like all things do that we take into our digestive tract. It goes out into every cell of our body. Our blood cells carry Jesus into our very being, so that I not only can experience his forgiveness for me, you can experience for you in that tangible thing, bread and wine. On my deathbed, I do exactly what Luther advised in the Sermon on Preparing to Die, and what he told so many people who were facing death and grief is that they simply have to count on the promises.
Yeah.
That when you have that in place, then you're prepared,
Mm-hmm.
and then you will live a good death. Luther wrote a letter to the parents of a student who had died in some accident while he was at the University of Wittenberg. And Luther sent this letter of consolation to the parents and told them not that their son was good enough, and that he was going to go to heaven because he was pious enough or had the right theology or whatever, or
Right.
good grades or whatever, but that their son, they could count on him being tucked away basically in the spear wound in Jesus' side because Jesus had made that so,
Hmm.
and that their son had trusted that promise.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
they could entrust their son to that,
hmm.
you
And
know.
what a good word to people who are grieving about a person that they
Right,
have lost,
especially if
because
that
it's
person is baptized,
right, exactly.
right? It
Yeah.
makes it so much easier to be a pastor in those situations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, in my first year and a half as a parish pastor, I think I dealt with 5, 6, 7 deaths of babies and toddlers. You haven't really been a pastor until you've been on a hillside at a cemetery above the Missouri River in January, and you're the one who is the sole pallbearer for a baby carrying that little white casket to the grave and setting it on a little fake grass covered block, um, and finding some word to declare to those parents that is gonna be strong enough that they can actually leave that little white casket there on the hillside and drive away.
Do you remember what you said exactly?
No, I mean, I think the words. This is where the church's 2,000-year experience is really helpful.
Yeah.
That in the church's liturgy, um, the language of faith has been developed that has stood the test of time, and that you don't have to come up with something new. All you have to declare is this is wrong. God regards it as a wrong, and God has promised that this child is His, and that you will know your child in the resurrection better
Mm-hmm.
than you've ever known them.
I think because of scripture, we have language that recognizes the gravity of death and the sadness of death, while also giving people hope. And that's a very unique thing. I think the way I see people handling death a lot of times who don't have that language is either to focus on just the gravity of death and let it loom over them, um, or to maybe there's not even language in this instance to just kind of deny it and pretend like it's not there. What problems do you see with how the world handles death, specifically in this day and age?
I don't think it's just our day and age.
Yeah.
I think it's just part of our human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Ernest Becker wrote the best book on this ever, The Denial of Death.
Mm-hmm.
It was published, I think, in 1972 or 73, something like that. It won the Pulitzer Prize that year. And it's really shaped my understanding of how we human beings regard death. That we can't bear the fact that we will end,
Yeah.
and that we don't have control, and that we have to face the fact that we're limited.
Right.
Um, I don't know if you've ever seen the musical Wicked.
I haven't.
You're so not cool.
I know.
Um,
I'm not a musical gal. Tell me about it.
in the musical Wicked, Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, throughout most of the play, um, faces her kind of being shunned by people around her because she's green.
Hmm.
And the thing, her "I Wish" song is mostly about wanting to be unlimited.
Okay.
Um, she sings, "I'm unlimited. My future is unlimited," and that she thinks that's the greatest good, is to be unlimited
Hmm.
at all. And only at the end of the play, when she discovers the freedom of being limited,
Hmm.
can um, can she actually be free and be herself, which is great.
That'll
Um,
preach.
oh yeah, totally. And that's, I think, what Becker was talking about back in the 70s.
Do you think that's the root of much of our fears as humans, the death itself? I guess not the denial, but our fear. Do you think that we can trace back a lot of what we fear to this fear of death? I don't know if you could say all fear.
Well, I think that we live in a culture that is really good at aiding that denial.
Yeah.
Our American penchant to lift up the individual and to say your rights are sacrosanct, that they're
Mm-hmm.
holy and all important. Um, Constantly, I mean, advertising does this as well. It
Right.
says that you are your own agent and you are the center of your own universe, and you need to create a, an identity for yourself. This is what um, Jean-Paul Sartre was talking about with French existentialism back in the mid 20th century. That there, it's everything is absurd and there's no meaning inherent in the world, and that means that you have to construct meaning for
Mm-hmm.
yourself, and that means you have to construct an identity for yourself.
Yeah.
And I guess we could argue that if you do that, then you will be able to experience a good death,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Right.
And now we that business has grown exponentially in the world of social media,
Right.
that my students cannot bring themselves to be away from the slab in their hands for the 50 minutes of a class period, because they're compelled to be constantly engaging in that stuff,
Yeah.
so that because that's where their identity lies. And if they have an identity there, then whether they can say this explicitly or not, then they've got some kind of legacy that
Right.
means they matter,
Yeah.
that their existence is justified,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you've got an online footprint.
Yeah.
You post stuff on Insta, and you've created a viral TikTok video to the latest Dua Lipa song. You know, that's how
Yeah.
cool I am.
Hey, you're cooler than me. Are you on
Yeah,
TikTok? I don't want to know. I'm
yeah.
not sure.
No,
Yeah, no,
I don't. I mean, I have the TikTok app, but I don't.
yeah, you have something that lasts. It's quantifiable in like to the second. You can see how well this construction of identity is doing, how people are reacting to it. And that gives you, I think we think, I mean, I follow totally into this. It gives me this sense of I'm okay. I matter.
And then you
I'm
do all that
valuable.
self-talk, don't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But then the problem is, of course, it's never enough, or there's times where it's not being quantified in the way that I would hope it would be.
Yeah.
And
And the
that's,
world tells you, Kelsi, that you can probably get what you need on that count from being part of a mom's group,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah,
And
right.
there you will get all the affirmation. You'll have cheerleaders. You can do this, Kels,
Mm-hmm.
right? You know, you'll get through those early months when your daughter's not sleeping.
Yeah,
You know when your kid is sick, you can do it. You can do it. You can have a career. And and the world will tell you this is especially true, I think, for women. You can do everything,
exactly.
right? And
Yeah.
you are unlimited,
Mm-hmm.
and who you are is the Holy of Holies,
Yeah.
and your existence is justified because you're doing it. You go, girlfriend.
Yeah. The problem, I think, is then those affirmations can support you for so long, but they're not. I think what we're arguing here is that they're not something, they're not eternal. There's
Yeah,
nothing,
and
there's
so
actually no true substance. Yes, they are nice in the moment, and they're not even necessarily, I would argue, bad. But if you don't have something deeper to stand on,
yeah,
um, you're in
and,
trouble.
and and to use Paul's theological language in his letters, um, all that stuff is justifying yourself by works
Yeah, exactly.
somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And that when you deny death, that's all that's left to you is works. And that the end of life is simply life itself. The
Hmm.
goal of life is to live life and to, YOLO, you only live once,
Yeah.
and FOMO, fear of missing out, and all of those cute little acronyms or initialisms, and that what's called for instead is something that comes from outside of yourself that justifies you and justifies your existence, that
Mm.
says you meet the mark.
Yeah.
And then when you've got that outside declaration, then that's where the good death happens, doesn't it? If our existence and our very selves is justified by this promise from outside of us in Christ Jesus, then we have to ask the question, how am I going to get that faith?
Yeah.
How can I have a death that's confident?
Mm-hmm.
And that means making sure you have a preacher,
Hmm.
that you know who's delivering the goods, that you have somebody who declares it to you again and again and again.
I'm not a pastor. I know a lot of people that listen are not pastors. Um, what advice would you give to normal, everyday people when it comes to trying to comfort someone close to us who is near death, or even just engaging in maybe it's even just simple engagement in conversations about death, which probably don't come up a ton, but how can we speak about death to those closest to us in a way um, that is truly Christian and um, gives people this word?
I would say that the place to start is with very practical matters. Okay.
Okay.
Things like understanding that your kids don't want your china,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
and they especially don't want grandma's furniture, you know.
Sometimes they might. I don't know.
Um, and and then get yourself a dang living will and durable power of attorney for healthcare decisions,
Hmm.
especially um, if you are in your 20s.
Hmm.
In my death and dying class, every student by the end of the semester has signed and notarized living will and durable power of attorney for healthcare decisions. because they learn that once they turn to 18, their parents have no access to any information on them at all legally.
Yeah.
And that they can show they love their family by having decisions made in advance about sustaining their life if they're in a kind of persistent vegetative state, things like that.
Okay.
That if you want a feeding tube, how long, and that you have those conversations with your loved ones, and you get those documents done, and you give copies to your loved ones. And then I tell my students have to do this over spring break so that they have conversations with their parents, and I would say plan your funeral.
Yeah.
But then if the gospel is true, and it is, then it has consequences for you. And it means that you have a new identity that is in place. Your resurrected identity is in place, Kelsi, long before your last breath happens. That as far as God's concerned, you are already dead and resurrected. That happened in your baptism. And that now you can start considering what being resurrected looks like. That when Jesus comes on, I don't like the term the last day, which is what we say in English, but in German they say the jüngste Tag, the youngest day, the new day. When Jesus comes on that day and raises the dead, what will your life look like in a world where sin, death, and the devil are not at your doorstep? And start living like that's true. And that means taking stock of your relationships. It means thinking about what your commitments in the world are. It means thinking about what you do when you step into the voting booth. It means thinking about how you use your money. It means having been given this incredible new life, and how you are a steward of that new life. That's not to be waited for, but is given already.
Yeah.
That are you gonna spend it swiping left and right on Tinder? It's just not. It just doesn't sound to me like what a life in complete and consistent, ongoing grace will be like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just love how practically you speak about death. I mean, these are, like you started out saying, there's some practical stuff to do for the sake of your neighbor, for the sake of loving those around you well, and getting set up, and then grounding us in who we are in Christ and the freedom that we have in life because of the death that He has died for us. I talk of that, and your proclamation of that just now makes me it makes me tear up, because there's freedom there.
And your three little kids, they need you to be somebody who clings to that promise.
Yeah.
And that very clinging yourself to Jesus, like Mary at the foot of the cross and John at the foot of the cross, are what you want those two sons and a daughter to know themselves, right? When my sister-in-law died suddenly, when my son was just going into 8th grade. We drove to the Twin Cities for the funeral, and it was horrible. She was 47, and her son found her in bed one morning. His dad was away out of town, out of state for a meeting, and he called me and said, "I just found my mom. I don't know what to do." You know, and we just, on that 4-hour trip to Minneapolis, we just kept having these waves of sorrow, and loss. Just this stunning shift in how we understood the world. And that on the way home, Sam said, it's always been my worst fear that Mom and Dad, that one of you would die.
Wow.
Because I don't think I could live if one of you died. But now I've had to see death. I've had to see Aunt Randy's dead body. I've had to go to a loved one's funeral. I've had to hear you and someone else preach. And I know I can do it now. You know, it's like my 8th grade, my kid is preaching this little sermon to me to say, I can trust the words that in my own sorrow I hardly even heard myself, and that I've got hope. You know, and isn't hope then, I guess, the other side of the coin of a troubled conscience? That it's the thing that doesn't exist without having had that trouble, that turmoil. The German word is Anfechtung. It's untranslatable, but it means terror, fear, turmoil, temptation, testing. That if you or anybody else is going through a time like that, the promise is that this is the first inkling that you will have of a resurrection that's to come.
Yeah. Amen. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you, Ken, so much. You brought me to tears. And I'm just so...
Check that off my box. Check that box on my list. I made Kelsi Klimbara cry.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast and show. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcasts. If you liked this conversation or you have liked any of the Outside Ourselves episodes in the past and you haven't done so already, I would love if you could give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you are listening. Leave a comment if you have a couple minutes to spare. Those things are really helpful in getting the word out about the show. If you're watching on YouTube, I'd love if you could subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone that you know. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back here in a couple weeks with our next guest.